At the last board meeting, he leaned in and said, "You're not relevant anymore." And then he moved on, like I was never part of the picture to begin with. That's how it ended. Not with a scandal, not with a fall, not even with a real goodbye. Just those words, dropped like cold ash on a warm fire, and the casual cruelty of someone who thought progress meant forgetting the hands that built the foundation. It was a project review. Nothing dramatic. I was there out of habit more than necessity. I still kept the old notebook, still contributed insights no one else had the history to offer. But that day, I wasn't even given a chair at the main table. I stood off to the side, behind a row of new hires and bright-eyed managers who spoke in acronyms and momentum. And then he turned toward me, with a voice quiet enough not to make a scene, but loud enough to bury itself in my chest. "You're not relevant." Not "thank you," not "we've learned so much from you," just that. For a moment I didn't even react. My face held still, practiced after years of leading meetings where emotions had to be tempered, where egos had to be managed. But inside, something cracked. Not anger, not pride. Something quieter. The slow, sinking realization that a lifetime's worth of effort could vanish. Not because it failed, but because it aged. I watched him continue, flipping through his sleek slides, referencing performance metrics and future targets. And as the room nodded and scribbled notes, I stood motionless, trying to understand when exactly my legacy had been repackaged as dead weight. It wasn't the first time I'd felt a shift. Over the past year, my name had started to disappear from credits, from conversations, from decisions. The newer staff called me sir, but rarely asked questions. They inherited my systems, my frameworks, the very vocabulary I introduced, but now they spoke it like it had always belonged to them. And I let it happen, not out of weakness, but out of belief. Belief that impact outlives attention, that if you built something strong enough, it would hold on its own, even if your name faded from the blueprints. But belief doesn't shield you from humiliation. Not when the people sitting at your table pretend not to see you standing right there. Later that day, I walked through the empty halls of the office, my office, and ran my fingers along the edge of the hallway wall where, years ago, they hung the photo of the founding team. My face was there once. Not out of vanity, out of fact. I was part of the beginning. I was the beginning in many ways. But now, even that photo was gone, replaced by modern slogans and marketing gloss. I paused at the door to the archive room. I had a key. Of course I did. No one had bothered to take it back. I stepped inside. The shelves were mostly untouched. Old files, framed articles, the legacy pieces no one wanted to throw away, but no longer had space to display. I pulled out a binder from the bottom shelf, the original design strategy from our first product launch. My notes, my sketches, my initials in red ink in the margins, pages yellowed with time, but intact. Proof that I had been here, that I had mattered. And still his words echoed, "You're not relevant anymore." Relevance, a moving target, a lie we tell ourselves to justify forgetting. But something in me stirred. Not defiance, not even the urge to fight. Just a deep, anchored calm. The kind that comes when you know truth doesn't need permission to last. Let them move on, let them erase, let them build glass towers on the stone I laid with bare hands. I would not argue. I would not beg to be seen. But the world has a strange way of remembering when it matters most. And soon they would remember, whether they were ready or not. Friends, let me take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever been told you were no longer needed? Or that your time had passed, even when you knew you still had more to give? If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow, and how we keep telling stories that matter. And now, let's continue. The room had changed. Not the walls or the long oak table. They were the same ones I had helped choose years ago, when the company was just beginning to dream of itself. Not the light fixtures or the faded print of the skyline hanging above the whiteboard. No, what had changed was something colder, something quieter. The space I once filled without question was no longer mine. I walked in just before the meeting started, as I always had. My name wasn't on the calendar invite. I had learned that a few weeks back. But habit has a way of ignoring exclusion. I'd been attending these meetings for 2 decades, through launches, crashes, rebuilds, and breakthroughs. I had led the first strategy call in this room when we had nothing but borrowed money and a half-formed prototype. My voice had once echoed off these walls with authority, but that morning there wasn't a chair left for me at the table. They didn't say anything. No one looked surprised. Some offered tight, polite nods, the kind that acknowledge your presence but not your place. One young manager, barely old enough to remember our second product line, slid a folder toward me like he thought it would make up for the fact that I was standing in the corner, holding my own notes in my hands like a guest waiting to be seated. I found an extra chair against the wall and sat down. No one stopped the meeting. No one paused to ask if I wanted to speak. I wasn't invisible. I was optional. Present but peripheral. Not forgotten, just repositioned. Like a painting that doesn't match the new decor but is too sentimental to throw away. They spoke in clean, rehearsed phrases. Forward momentum. Agility. Repositioning for scale. Buzzwords filled the air like foam. Pretty, but empty. I knew every layer behind the numbers they were presenting, every system they were now proposing to streamline. I had built half of them, line by line, night after night, when we didn't yet have funding, and faith was all we could afford. But no one asked. No one turned to me when questions about legacy data came up. They guessed. They fumbled. They postured. And I sat there, papers on my lap, mouth closed, watching them reconstruct things I had already solved years ago. And then, for one brief moment, a slide flashed on the screen, a diagram I recognized immediately. I had drawn it during a late-night session, hunched over my desk with a half-eaten sandwich beside my keyboard. They had copied it exactly. No attribution, no footnote, just repackaged and recolored. The presenter, someone new, someone polished, stood proudly beside it, explaining the revolutionary approach they were implementing. I didn't flinch. I didn't correct him. I didn't need the room to know it was mine, but I felt something else rise inside me. Not anger, not sorrow, but a cold, hollow ache, like watching your own handwriting signed by someone else, like hearing a familiar melody played too fast, too clean, with none of the soul left in it. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped, chatter resumed, and people filed out. I stood slowly, the weight of the paper stack in my arms far less than the weight in my chest. No one asked for my input. No one followed me out. I walked past the glass walls that used to frame my office. It now belonged to someone else. New nameplate, new chair, same view. And as I reached the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. Not a ghost. Not yet. But a man who had helped build the room, and now sat outside it watching others take credit for the shape of the walls. That morning I learned something quietly devastating. Erasure doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with indifference and silence. A silence so complete it makes you question whether you were ever loud enough to begin with. There was a time when my phone would light up before sunrise, not with pleasantries, but with need, real need, a system breaking, a deal stalling, a decision no one wanted to make alone. And my name, once spoken with a kind of quiet urgency, had meant something more than seniority. It meant trust. It meant stability. Now the phone stayed still. The requests came not for guidance, but for approval. And not even that, really. Just a signature. A ceremonial nod to make things official, though the real choices had been made long before I was even looped in. Sometimes they didn't even wait for me. Sometimes I'd find out from a forwarded email that my name had already been attached. Out of efficiency, they'd say. It's strange how something so small, the absence of a question, the disappearance of a voice in a room, can change everything. There's a quiet moment that hits you. The first time you realize they've stopped asking what you think. Not out of disrespect, out of disuse. Like an old tool they admire but no longer pick up. I remember one afternoon, a junior team lead, one who used to ask me to review his presentations when he was still learning to stand in front of clients, walked past my desk and dropped a stack of documents. "Just need your signature on the last page," he said, without even meeting my eyes. No context, no explanation, just ink. I looked at the papers, scanned the language, and paused. There were choices in there. Real ones. Terms that carried weight. Risks I would have advised against. But no one had asked. They didn't want advice. They wanted a rubber stamp. I could have pushed back. But what would that have meant? A delay? A debate? A reminder that I still cared? That I still knew? I signed. Not because I agreed, but because the fight to be heard had started to feel heavier than the consequence of being ignored. After he left, I stared at my own name on the page, sharp and neat in black ink, and felt none of the authority it once carried. It looked like a relic, an old label on a newer product. And I thought about how easily a name can become a formality, how legacy gets boiled down to legal obligation. I used to sit at the center of strategy, ask not just what we should do, but why. My mind was a sounding board, my memory a map through years of trial, error, and hard-earned progress. Now my job was to keep quiet while others drew new lines across a terrain I had once surveyed by hand. And it wasn't just about being passed over. It was about being uninvited from relevance. There's a special kind of grief in that. Not the grief of loss, but of fading. Of watching your own contributions turn into scaffolding that others climb while pretending it was always there. They still said my name in meetings, still listed me as founding advisor on internal documents. But those were just phrases, polite placeholders. Behind the words, I could feel the truth. I had become something to reference, not something to consult. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was pretending I didn't notice it, pretending I hadn't felt the shift, pretending the absence of my voice was a courtesy, not a decision, pretending that the seat they left empty was mine by choice. But I knew better. I had spent years earning the right to be heard, not just listened to, heard. And now the room didn't echo anymore, because the place where my voice used to live had already been filled with noise. The new brochure arrived without fanfare, just a stack of them sitting neatly on the counter near the reception, thick and glossy, like the kind you'd find at a tech expo or executive lounge, carefully arranged, meticulously aligned, as if precision alone could convince someone of meaning. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if one of the interns hadn't dropped a copy on my desk that morning. He smiled, politely, probably told to distribute them to everyone on the third floor. He didn't know what he was handing me. To him, it was just another polished printout from marketing. To me, it would become a mirror I wasn't ready to look into. The cover was sleek, dark navy with silver text stamped into the cardstock, "The future built today." There was a tagline beneath it, thinner and sharper, celebrating our impact, shaping what's next. I should have known. Still, I flipped it open, the pages stiff and rich under my fingers, the scent of fresh ink rising like something too new to question. The first few spreads were expected. Executive letters, mission statements, high-level charts. Then the project features began, one by one, polished, bright, confident. And then I saw it. A full-page section titled, "Pillar Systems, Streamlining Operations Across the Global Network." There it was, the very system I had spent 2 years building, not managing, building. Late nights, unstable frameworks, emergency calls. I had practically lived in the server rooms, rewiring processes, documenting architecture, rewriting legacy scripts line by line, fighting off burnout with cold coffee and stubbornness. It had held. When everyone else had panicked during the global shutdown, this system had been the only thing keeping operations intact. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was fast, but because it worked. Because I had made it work. And now, a smiling executive, new, younger, dressed in perfectly tailored blue, was quoted across the page, talking about redefining infrastructure at scale. He was proud, the team was proud, and I wasn't mentioned, not once. No asterisk, no original architect, no legacy contributor, just silence, clean, intentional silence. I read the paragraph again, slower this time, hoping I'd missed it, hoping that somewhere, buried beneath the empty terminology, there'd be a nod, a hint, a thread I could pull to say, "They remember," but there was nothing. And then I turned the page. Another spread, another system, one I'd helped stabilize when it was on the brink of failure. Same story, no name. Again, again, again. With each turn, I felt my chest tighten. Not like a punch. That would have been simpler. This was quieter. Like being gently pushed backward, over and over, until you forget what it feels like to stand in your own story. They hadn't erased me with cruelty. They had just left me out. That's how it starts, isn't it? You're not fired. You're not dishonored. You're not insulted. You're just not there anymore. At first, you think it's an oversight, a printing mistake, a rushed deadline. You want to believe in their good intentions. You want to think they must have assumed I didn't mind. And maybe they really did. Maybe it didn't even occur to them to include me. And that's the sharpest cut of all. Not that they tried to forget you, that they didn't have to. I closed the brochure and placed it on the edge of my desk. It sat there like a weightless stone, beautiful and silent. I looked out the window, where the skyline shimmered faintly behind the haze, and wondered how many of the buildings I could see were also missing the names of the people who held them together. I thought of my office, now smaller than the one I used to have. I thought of the hallway wall, once lined with photos of milestones I had lived through, now replaced by abstract art. I thought of the onboarding video I helped write, the one that had once started with a tribute to those who came before. That line had been removed in the latest version, I'd noticed. And I thought of how names disappear, not with fire, but with design. Not because they weren't worthy, but because they were no longer useful. I picked up the brochure one more time. Not out of masochism, out of ritual. I ran my finger along the edge of the page where my system lived without me. I didn't feel anger. Not then. I just felt quiet. Like a house left standing after the party ends, still sturdy, still upright, but empty in a way that no one sees unless they lived there once. That night I didn't bring it home. I left it on the break room table. Maybe someone would pick it up. Maybe they'd be proud to see their name inside. I hoped they would be. But deep down, I also hoped that one day someone would flip to that section, run their finger along the design and wonder, who started this? Who carried this through before the cameras came? And maybe, just maybe, they'd ask. Because erasure begins in silence. But memory has a voice of its own. And eventually, if the work was real, it speaks. It happened in the hallway. The kind of place where conversations are born accidentally. Not in meetings, not in emails, but in the quiet, in-between moments when people pass each other without expecting meaning to interrupt. He was new. Sharp suit, crisp shoes, perfect posture, the kind that hadn't yet learned to bend. One of the rising names from a recent hire wave, fresh from a program that trained managers to speak with confidence before they learned to listen with humility. I hadn't intended to speak with him at all. We had crossed paths by the elevator. I offered a nod, not to start a conversation, but out of habit, out of decency. He paused, polite enough to match the gesture, maybe even nervous for a beat, though he didn't show it. And then, with the kind of sincerity that comes from youth not yet tempered by the gravity of silence, he said it. You've already done your part. There's a lot of respect for that, but time moves on. He smiled, one of those half-formed practice smiles, and then he walked away. No handshake, no eye contact, no space for reply. And I stood there, staring at the elevator doors, hearing them open with a soft mechanical sigh that sounded far too much like an exhale after being told to let go. You've already done your part. Time moves on. The words weren't cruel. That's what made them land harder. They were said with respect, or at least the version of respect that doesn't require depth. The kind that sounds right on paper, but feels hollow in the mouth. I knew what he meant. He meant, we appreciate you, until we don't need to carry your name anymore. He meant, we'll nod at the door you once held open, but we've already built another entrance. He meant, we want the fruits of your labor, not the presence of your hands. And maybe he didn't even know he meant that. Maybe he thought he was being kind, acknowledging my contributions, the way one might nod toward a statue in a park without stopping to read the plaque. But kindness without understanding isn't kindness at all. It's erasure with a ribbon tied around it. I stayed by the elevator longer than I should have, not because I was hurt, not at first, but because I was tired. Tired in the way only someone can be who's spent decades carrying things, not just responsibilities, but remembrance, carrying systems in his mind, people in his heart, and values in his spine. I didn't resent him for his youth. I remembered my own, but I had never looked at a man who built the ground beneath me and said, "Thanks, now step aside." That kind of thinking doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from a world that no longer honors memory unless it trends. I walked away without saying anything. I passed the familiar posters on the walls, the framed slogans that talked about legacy and collaboration. And I wondered how many of the people who wrote those words could name the ones who embodied them. Legacy isn't a slogan, it's a choice. It's choosing to remember, to include, to ask. It's choosing to say, you are not just what you've done, you are still here. You still matter. But they didn't know how to say that. Or worse, they didn't want to. That night, I pulled out one of my old notebooks. Not out of bitterness, out of muscle memory. I flipped through diagrams drawn by hand, notes made at 2 a.m. after breakthroughs that only happened because we refused to quit. I saw the names of people who had long since retired, some passed on. I remembered how we used to sit in the basement conference room, dreaming up things we couldn't afford, because we believed in what they might become. And now, a young man in a hallway had reduced it all to a nod and a phrase. "You've already done your part." He meant it as closure, but I've built things that still stand, systems that still run, people who still build on what I created. And as long as those live, I haven't done my part. I'm still doing it, even if they're too busy replacing nameplates to notice. Respect without presence is a quiet way of saying, we liked you better as history, but I wasn't history. Not yet. Not even close. It was late. The kind of late where the house is still, and even the air seems to hold its breath. I hadn't turned on any lights except the one in my study, a small lamp that cast a soft amber glow across the room, as if it, too, understood that what I was about to do needed quiet. Reverence. I stood in front of the cabinet in the corner, the old metal one with the scuffed handle and the dent in the lower drawer. It had followed me through 2 office moves, a downsizing and eventually retirement from the floor to this quiet space at home. For years it had stood there unopened, unremarkable, not because I forgot about it, but because I didn't need to open it. I knew what was inside, and for a long time that knowing had been enough. But something had changed. Not all at once, but slowly, like water wearing down stone. Each ignored comment, each project I was no longer part of, each quiet omission, it added up. And tonight, after that hallway exchange, after being told so casually that my time had moved on, I felt a kind of ache that words couldn't carry. Not pain, not resentment. Displacement. I knelt and opened the bottom drawer. The scent of old paper hit first. Not musty, just worn, like time itself had settled into the fibers. I reached in and pulled out the first folder. The paper was soft at the edges, edges curled from years of flipping, some pages held together with rusted clips. Handwritten notes, hand-drawn diagrams, lines that weren't just measurements, they were memory. Here was the sketch of the interface we'd developed on a whiteboard over pizza and coffee. Here was the schematic for the emergency override system we built in 2010, the one that kept a manufacturing line from shutting down during a blackout. I remembered staying up all night to finish it, back when staying up all night still felt heroic. Underneath were project folders labeled in my handwriting. Careful block letters, always in pencil. I had never liked ink. Ink felt too sure of itself. Pencil allowed room for evolution, for mistakes, for humility. And then, deeper still, came the awards. Not trophies. Nothing with marble or gold, just plaques, certificates, letters, words that back then had meant something. For extraordinary contribution. For leadership in crisis. For vision. I ran my fingers across the engraving on one, my name carved into metal. Solid, permanent, a sharp contrast to how temporary everything felt now. I wasn't digging for ego. I wasn't looking for praise. I didn't want to be told I was important. I just needed to remember that I had been. That I had once stood in the center of something that mattered. Not for the applause, but for the impact. That my work had held weight. That people had counted on me, trusted me, turned to me in rooms now filled with strangers. I found the old staff photo. We were younger. Some gone now. Some forgotten. My face was in the center, not because I asked for it, but because I had earned it. I remembered the photographer saying, "Put the guy who started this in the middle." Everyone had laughed. I had too. I held the photo in both hands, and for a long moment I just looked. And then I breathed, deep, slow. Not because I felt better, but because something inside me unlocked. Not a wound, a reminder. They could erase my name from brochures. They could stop inviting me to meetings. They could replace me on project dashboards and let someone younger present my work. But they couldn't rewrite the truth. This drawer existed. This paper existed. I existed. Even if they no longer looked back, the trail behind them had my footprints in its foundation. They were walking on something I had poured years into. And whether or not they ever turned around to see it didn't change the fact that it held. And maybe I didn't want to be part of their future anymore. But I wasn't going to let them unwrite my past. So I sat down, surrounded by paper and silence, and let memory return. Not to grieve what was lost, but to honor what was mine, and to quietly promise they may forget. But I won't. The mirror in the hallway wasn't large, just a rectangular pane tucked between two faded picture frames, one with a watercolor landscape my daughter painted in college, the other a photograph from the company's 5th anniversary, where I stood in the center, arm around the co-founder, both of us laughing like we hadn't yet learned what weight truly felt like. I passed that mirror every day. Most days I barely looked, but that morning I stopped. Not for a reason I could name, not because something caught my attention, but because something didn't. I had moved through the hallway slowly, mug in hand, thinking of nothing and everything, when I caught my reflection out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked older, I'd made peace with age, not because I looked tired, I'd lived with fatigue for years, but because I looked misplaced, like a figure left behind in a painting that had long since changed themes. I stepped closer. The face in the glass was familiar, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. There was steadiness, yes, but not certainty. I saw the lines etched by long days, the graying stubble I hadn't bothered to shave, the shirt wrinkled from sitting too long at a desk no one visited. But what I really saw, what I couldn't look away from, was doubt. It had settled into my shoulders, into the corners of my mouth. It was the kind of doubt that doesn't come all at once. It seeps in slowly, through ignored messages, through rooms you're no longer asked to enter, through the sound of your own name no longer spoken aloud. For years, I had been the foundation, the person others turned to when decisions had weight, the one who spoke not for attention, but because people knew I wouldn't speak unless it mattered. Now, I wasn't sure. And the worst part, I wasn't just doubting them, I was starting to doubt me. I began to question whether I had held on too long, whether I was the only one who hadn't noticed the tide had shifted, whether my presence, once a source of steadiness, had become an anchor instead. Had I become ballast? Was I now something they carried out of obligation, not value? The question lodged itself deeper with each day. I found myself second-guessing the emails I sent, rereading them before clicking send, asking myself whether I sounded desperate. I stayed quiet in meetings, even when I knew I had something meaningful to add, because I didn't trust the weight of my own voice anymore. Even the younger staff who used to seek me out had stopped. I'd watch them gather in conference rooms, solving problems I'd solved before, reinventing processes I'd once refined, and I'd hear my own thoughts echoing through their words, without ever being named. And I didn't know what was worse, that they had taken from me without acknowledgement, or that I had started to believe I no longer had anything worth giving. That mirror, it didn't lie. But it didn't offer mercy either. It reflected back a man who had carried rooms, now standing alone in a hallway, asking a question he never thought he'd have to ask. Was I only valuable when I was needed? And if so, what am I now? I walked away slowly. My reflection lingered a second longer before fading from view, but the feeling didn't leave. It followed me through the day, into the kitchen, into the emails I didn't open, into the unfinished folder on my desktop with a project proposal no one had asked for, and that I now wasn't sure I should even finish. I'd always believed that usefulness wasn't tied to age, but to clarity, to consistency, to character. I had lived that belief, but now I wasn't so sure. The silence I'd been met with wasn't just around me anymore. It was inside. and it sounded like someone closing a door gently, without ever saying goodbye. I didn't tell anyone, not because it was a secret, and not because I feared rejection. I had weathered storms far louder than silence, but because, for once, I didn't want opinions. I didn't want encouragement. I didn't even want permission. I just wanted to do something that reminded me that I still existed, fully, deliberately on paper. The call for nominations had come through in a mass email a week earlier. One of those newsletters most people delete without reading. I almost did the same. But some part of me, the part that still believed in quiet courage, paused when I saw the subject line. Lifetime contribution, nomination portal now open. I clicked it, almost without thinking. The page loaded slowly, like it, too, knew this wasn't something to be rushed. The form was simple. Name, years of service, description of work, impact, attachments. I stared at the empty fields, the blinking cursor waiting to be told something meaningful. And for a few minutes, I hesitated. Because this wasn't just an application, it was a confession. A private, stubborn plea to no one in particular that said, I was here, I mattered, I still matter. And submitting it wouldn't prove anything to them. It would prove something to me. I began to type, not like a resume, not like a pitch, just like someone laying bricks, slow, steady, with care. I wrote about systems built in crisis. I wrote about nights spent debugging lines of code when the whole company was asleep. I wrote about people, colleagues I had mentored, interns I had watched grow into leaders, teams that had leaned on me not just for answers, but for presence. I didn't embellish, I didn't market. I told the truth, the way welders tell you where the steel gave first, with precision and a kind of sorrow that only comes from having been there when it mattered. And as I wrote, something strange happened. The doubt didn't leave, but it stepped aside, just enough for memory to breathe. I remembered the first month after we launched our second platform, when the whole infrastructure buckled under pressure and everyone panicked. And I stayed until dawn, rebuilding the thing from the command line up. No one asked me to. I just couldn't walk away from something I helped create. I remembered designing the core logic for our diagnostic tool, the same logic still used today, even if no one remembers where it came from. I remembered the moment our CEO once said, in a room full of executives, if we had to start from scratch and only keep one person, it'd be him. No one said that anymore, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. I finished writing, attached the files, and hovered over the submit button. For a moment, my finger didn't move, not because I was afraid of being rejected, but because I was afraid of what it would mean if I wasn't. Because if I still was worthy, if someone out there still saw the weight of my work, then maybe all this fading had been a choice made by people too young to know the cost of forgetting. And if I wasn't, then maybe they were right. But I clicked submit, quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses. It wasn't for applause. It wasn't even for the award. It was for something smaller, more sacred. To remind myself that my name still had breath, that it could still leave the confines of memory and step out onto a form, a page, a line in a record that might outlast the indifference. Later that night, I printed a copy and placed it in the drawer where I kept my old blueprints and field notes. Not because I expected to look at it again, but because that drawer had always held what I believed in. And now it held one more thing, proof that even if the world had stopped asking for my voice, I was still willing to speak. The days blurred, not from monotony, but from quiet necessity, the kind of rhythm that doesn't draw attention, but keeps everything from falling apart behind the scenes. While others moved through the office with purpose and presentation decks, rehearsing jargon and graphs that glittered under fluorescent lights, I stayed in the corners, in the systems, in the silence. They were building things above the surface. I was holding up what they were standing on. No one noticed, at least not out loud. They didn't see the back-end scripts I rebalanced at 3 a.m. after the new update nearly took down the diagnostics dashboard. They didn't ask who had patched the logic loop that was crashing their automated reports. No one realized the server that magically stabilized during their demo had been manually reconfigured by me over a lukewarm cup of coffee, just minutes before they logged in. And that was the thing. There was no applause, no recognition, no thank you email. But I didn't ask for those things. I never had. Because the work was never about being seen. It was about seeing what no one else knew was there. and fixing it before it made a sound. That kind of work doesn't have a spotlight. It doesn't go on slides. But without it, the whole show collapses. I'd walk through the office and pass rooms filled with voices, mock pitches, shiny presentations running on my architecture. And I'd wonder, not bitterly, just curiously, do they know how much of their confidence depends on invisible scaffolding? I'd pass by whiteboards covered in new solutions that mirrored systems I built years ago. The labels had changed. The formatting was slicker, but the bones were the same. My bones. I became the silent redundancy, the fallback, the assumed constant. If something broke, I fixed it. If something cracked, I reinforced it. If someone panicked, they called eventually, after trying everything else, after Googling, after asking each other, after the meeting had already started and the screen still wouldn't load. Then, and only then, they'd remember the man who used to sit at the center. But most days I just worked. No interruptions, no meetings, just the quiet hum of code and function, the slow, deliberate caretaking of systems that didn't know how to rest. And strangely, there was something beautiful in that. Because beneath all the noise of irrelevance and fading, I still knew something no one else seemed to notice. I mattered. Not because of title, not because of trend, but because when things needed to work, I was still the one holding the line, even if they never looked down to see it. That week, one of the junior analysts presented a breakthrough efficiency model. I watched from the back of the room as she beamed, gesturing to numbers that looked suspiciously familiar. It was a performance patch I'd written 3 months prior, one she had stumbled across in a shared directory and adapted. No mention of me. But the model worked. The system didn't crash, and they moved forward, never knowing how close they had come to failure. I walked out quietly, past the conference rooms, past the framed mission statement, past the elevator doors that still reflected my image faintly back at me. I didn't flinch. I didn't slow. Because I knew, and knowing was enough. Some people chase applause, some chase promotion. But I had built my life around something older, something stronger. Stewardship, craft, responsibility. Things that don't disappear when the headlines do. Things that don't need a podium to be real. And even if I stood alone in the shadows now, I knew the truth. When the lights flicker, when the polished floor begins to buckle, when the pretty slides fail to load, they'll come looking for the man who never stopped caring. And I'll still be here. It was a Wednesday, one of those days that feels like an echo, indistinguishable from the one before or the one that would follow. The kind of day where the coffee tastes like memory, and the hours pass in soft, invisible movements. I had just finished adjusting a line of code that prevented a cascade failure in the company's notification system. No one had noticed the bug, not yet, but it would have collapsed half the infrastructure under the surface by Friday. So I fixed it, quietly, carefully. Then I closed the window, stretched my hands, and leaned back. That's when the ping came. Not from engineering, not from support, but from communications and culture. It was a short message, polite, almost cheerful. They were putting together an internal report, some glossy, well-designed document to show investors how the company honored its legacy while leaning into the future. A slide titled, Bridging the Generations. Would I be willing, they asked, to be photographed next to one of the newer hires, maybe by the server room or with some cables in the background, they suggested, just to capture the symbolism. It would mean a lot. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was offended, not exactly, but because something about the request felt hollow, not cruel, not even dishonest, just empty. They wanted the idea of me, not the reality, not the stories, not the sweat, not the nights spent on floors with a flashlight in my mouth and a motherboard in my hands. Just a smile, just a symbol. So I said yes. I put on the same shirt I always wore. Nothing branded, no awards on the desk behind me, just me, the way I had always shown up. Fully, plainly, present. The photographer was kind, young, a contractor. She didn't know my name until someone whispered it to her. I didn't mind. She was just doing her job. We stood near the cooling units. Another engineer stood beside me, one of the new hires from a recent boot camp program. He looked nervous, then excited, then confused. I could tell no one had explained to him who I was, only that I was part of the legacy. We smiled. Or rather, he did. I lifted the corners of my mouth, just enough to make the photo usable, but not enough to lie. Because a real smile requires more than muscle. It needs memory and dignity and something to stand on. And in that moment, I wasn't sure what part of me they wanted to stand on. The shutter clicked 3 times. Then it was done. They thanked me, told me I would really elevate the layout, said something about continuity and institutional memory. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because disagreement would have required too many words. Words they wouldn't have heard, or worse, would have twisted into something poetic. I walked back to my desk and sat down slowly. A week later, the report was released. My photo appeared on page 6, beside a pull quote that read, "Legacy is the foundation of innovation." Beneath that, my name, misspelled. No title, no years of service, no context. Just a body beside a younger body. An image crafted for symmetry, not for truth. And still, I didn't get angry, because what they failed to write, I still carried. In my lungs, in my knuckles, in the folders with revisions no one else noticed, in the heartbeat of the systems that ran because I had made them human proof. They could paste my face wherever they wanted. They could shrink my story to a caption, but they could never undo the quiet architecture I'd laid beneath their progress. And I knew, deep down, that one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but one day, someone would ask, who built this? Who held it together? Whose hands made the blueprint before we were born into the comfort of it? And when they did, that smile I forced for the camera would mean nothing. But the work? The work would still be running. The day came quietly. No red mark on the calendar. No countdowns. No whispered anticipation around the office printer. Just another Tuesday, filtered through fluorescent lights and lukewarm coffee. But I remembered. I had known the date for weeks. Not because I expected anything, but because I needed something to look toward. A moment. A point on the horizon that said, there is still movement, even if no one sees it. I didn't tell anyone it was today. Not because I was hiding, but because by now I understood how little space people had in their minds for stories that didn't start with themselves. They had meetings, sprint deadlines, Slack threads exploding with emojis and updates about features I once dreamed of building before they belonged to someone else's hands. I sat at my desk that morning longer than usual, not doing much, just listening. To the building, to the rhythm, to the sound of a world that had learned to move without me at its center. And what I heard was nothing. No message. No curious knock on the glass. No casual, hey, wasn't that award thing today? Not even a misremembered good luck or a distracted thumbs up in the hallway. It was as if the day itself had slipped through the floorboards carrying my name with it. And for a moment, a full, aching, wordless moment, I believed them. All of them. I believed I was no longer here. Not really. Just a figure who sat quietly near the edge of relevance, contributing out of habit, not invitation. The old engineer who wouldn't retire, the background process, the human placeholder. I opened the award website on my screen, not to check if I had won, but just to see if the page still worked, if anything I touched would still respond to me. It did. The site loaded slowly, not from traffic, but from indifference. The headline read, "Finalists will be contacted by end of day." No email came, no call. I checked my inbox 3 times, then again at lunch. By 3 p.m., I stopped refreshing. Not out of acceptance, but out of mercy. Sometimes the cruelest thing isn't hearing no, it's hearing nothing at all. It was the kind of absence that doesn't echo, it just disappears. I left the office early that day, but no one noticed. No one asked. No one paused mid-sentence to say, hey, you okay? They were preparing for some off-site meeting. There were spreadsheets open, booking links being passed around, laughter near the snack bar. Someone was arguing about catering options. I walked past it all, through the glass door, into the afternoon that had forgotten my name. Outside, the city moved as if nothing monumental had been lost. And maybe, in the grand scheme, it hadn't. Maybe the world didn't need reminders. But I did. Because this silence wasn't neutral. It was layered. It had shape. It had memory. And in its stillness, it whispered something I couldn't ignore. You are now optional. Not obsolete. Not dismissed. Just not required. That kind of exile doesn't come with cruelty. It comes with politeness, with nods, with ghost chairs in rooms that used to carry your voice. And yet, as I stood outside the office that evening watching shadows stretch along the sidewalk, I felt something shift. Not in the world, in me, because I had once built systems from silence. I had once pulled function out of emptiness. And if the world had stopped saying my name, then maybe it was time I said it again, not for them, but for what was coming. The remote was on the armrest where I had left it that morning, a routine placement, like hanging up your coat even when no one is home. I didn't plan to watch anything. I rarely did anymore. The noise of television had started to feel artificial. All motion, no meaning. But that night, maybe out of fatigue or instinct or some faint resistance to silence, I picked it up and pressed the first button my thumb found. The screen blinked to life, bright, unapologetic. A local news anchor sat in front of the city skyline. Hair perfect, posture practiced. The kind of broadcast I used to ignore while fixing network cables under desks, while others gathered around break room screens to catch weather updates or headlines. I was never newsworthy. I was background. I didn't even register her words at first. And now to our closing story. A name some of you may not recognize, but one the city knows well, even if silently. My ears sharpened, not in hope, just curiosity. A special lifetime recognition was quietly announced today by the Engineering Advancement Commission, honoring decades of infrastructure development that shaped this region's most trusted systems. I sat forward, something in the tone, reverent, slow, deliberate. I could feel it before she said it. The award, which has only been given 3 times in the past 20 years, will be presented next month to... She paused. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but real. Then she said my name. Full, clear, unmistaken. No shortening, no error. Just mine. I didn't move. I didn't blink. For work that quietly held up a generation of systems. Work often invisible to the public, but essential. Tonight, we honor not just the legacy, but the person behind it. Behind her, the screen faded to images I hadn't seen in years. Bridges, terminals, server arrays I had once configured by hand with a flashlight and a wrench. No filters, no AI mock-ups, just photographs of what was real. Not once in all my life had I heard my name said like that on television. Not in ceremonies, not in meetings, certainly not in front of thousands. But there it was, pronounced not with hype, but with weight. With the kind of gravity you can't manufacture. The kind that's earned one quiet day at a time. I exhaled, and for the first time in months, I realized just how long I had been holding my breath. I didn't cry, I didn't cheer, that's not who I am, but my chest shook slightly. Not from emotion I could name, but from the sheer collision of memory and truth. Because this wasn't just an award, it was proof. Proof that the work hadn't disappeared. That it had left fingerprints in the cables, in the code, in the city's very rhythm. And someone, somewhere had traced those fingerprints all the way back to me. They had seen, even when no one else did, even when the office forgot, even when the young voices said I was no longer relevant. They had seen, and more than that, they had spoken. Loudly, publicly, irrefutably. I looked around my living room, the same chair, the same faded carpet, a mug still warm from tea I hadn't finished. But everything felt different now. Not because the world had changed, but because the silence had. It was no longer empty. Now it echoed, with something louder than applause. With acknowledgement. With memory. With truth. And that night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I let the screen stay on. The next morning felt strangely still, even before I stepped through the doors. The air outside was calm, heavy with the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from a shift, like the quiet before a storm, or the breath held after a truth is spoken too loudly to ignore. I had walked the same sidewalk for years, same trees, same concrete path with its familiar crack near the loading dock. But that morning everything felt more awake. When I entered the building, the usual rhythm was gone. No footsteps rushing past. No greetings over coffee cups. No muffled jokes from the design pod. The front desk receptionist gave a small, startled nod. Not forced, not polite, but reverent, like she had just remembered something important and didn't know how to say it out loud. I kept walking. I passed the common area. 2 younger staffers sat with open laptops and untouched mugs. They stopped mid-conversation when I entered, eyes shifting down like students caught whispering in church. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence followed me all the way to the main floor. And then I stepped into the room. The meeting had already started, or tried to. A few slides hung frozen on the monitor. Someone had been presenting, but their voice had trailed off mid-sentence, and no one had filled the space. I could feel it. Not confusion, not resistance, but awareness. They had seen it. Someone, maybe one of them, had watched the news the night before, or read the mention online, or opened their email that morning and saw the notice in the internal bulletin. Lifetime Recognition Award announced, my full name, honored for foundational contributions. No banner, no celebration, but the message had landed like thunder anyway, because up until now I had been furniture. Predictable, present, unnoticed. But now I was a story they hadn't written and couldn't explain away. I moved to my seat at the far end, the one I had claimed years ago, not because it was special, but because it was out of the way. I didn't like to be the center. I never did. I preferred the view from the edge where I could see what needed reinforcing, what part of the team was straining under pressure. But this morning the room strained for something else entirely, a sense of footing, a recalibration. The director cleared his throat. That sound, small, mechanical, nervous, broke the stillness like glass. He tried to recover the flow of the meeting, but his voice faltered. I caught the flicker of a glance in my direction. So did others. Some didn't meet my eyes at all, and in their silence I heard everything they didn't say. The young man who once laughed about legacy being a museum thing. The colleague who had said, "Your way is solid, but we're moving faster now." The assistant who had called my input nostalgic. The lead who never once asked how I built the system she now ran. Now their words weighed differently. Now they remembered. Not just what I had done, but that I had done it when there were no roadmaps, no templates, no safety nets. When mistakes meant outages, not just PR corrections. Their monitors blinked. Charts, slides, projections, all glowing faintly in front of people who suddenly looked small beneath the weight of something older, deeper. A truth they hadn't made room for until it showed up on national television. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. That would have made it smaller than it was. I just opened my notebook, quietly, like I had 100 times before. The pages were filled with sketches, revisions, protocols written by hand, because I still believed in the precision of ink. I turned to a blank page and began taking notes. Let them adjust, let them learn, let them find their own voices again. But now they knew what it sounded like when silence broke and the name they had nearly erased came back, not in volume but in presence, unshakable. Earned, still here. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden outpouring, no cathartic moment of applause, no awkward gathering in the break room with a cake someone forgot to personalize. That's not how real shifts happen, not the kind that leave a mark. Real change comes slowly, like water through stone. Quiet, patient, unstoppable. They didn't apologize. There were no dramatic gestures, no formal acknowledgments of what had been overlooked, no retroactive praise trying to make up for years of being bypassed, stepped around, or smiled past. The same people who once dismissed my thoughts as outdated didn't come to me with lowered eyes or trembling hands, but they listened. That was new. In meetings where once I was talked over, now there was space. When I spoke, no one nodded too quickly or moved on too fast. They paused, took in the words, not just the content, but the weight behind them. I noticed it in their pens. They took notes when I spoke now. In the silence that followed my suggestions, not dismissive, but considering, in how someone once finished my sentence, then stopped halfway through and said, "Actually, go on." They didn't say you were right, but they leaned in. And that was louder than any apology. The seat next to the project manager used to be unassigned, unofficially left open for latecomers or interns. That week, it was cleared. The cables were untangled, the extra chair removed, and when I walked in, I saw my name, neatly written on a folded card, as if it had always been there. No one said whose idea it was. No one made a scene. I just sat, and for once I didn't have to shrink myself to fit the room. No slideshow introduced me. No title screen declared honoree. But when a problem arose, one of those small, invisible issues that only shows itself to those who've seen the whole machine, the team looked to me, not out of desperation, out of trust. That's how truth moves. Not in grand announcements, but in quiet redirections. Not in applause, but in a gaze that finally holds still. I caught glimpses of it even in the hallway. Someone who once brushed past me now slowing their step to match mine. A junior staffer holding a door longer than necessary. The director nodding as I passed, not with superiority, not with duty, but with acknowledgement. That's what I had fought for without ever raising my voice. To be seen. To be heard not as a formality, but because the words mattered. To no longer be formally respected, but currently trusted. It didn't need a plaque. It didn't need a standing ovation. It just needed that one thing I had gone without for so long. A seat. Not out of politeness, but because the table was never complete without me. And now, without saying a word, they understood that too. Sometimes I still catch the clip. Not because I search for it, but because others do. It shows up in emails forwarded by people I haven't spoken to in years. It plays quietly on a screen in the corner of an office I'm visiting. Someone sends me a link with a note that just says, "Look what came up today." I never turn the volume up. I don't need to. I already know how it sounds. That voice, calm, professional, a little too polished, reading my name, not as a footnote, not as a memory, but as current tense. No once was, no used to be, no phrases like retired visionary or a former contributor, just my name, followed by present action. Today we honor an award presented to work that continues to shape, no nostalgia, just now. It always catches me off guard. Not the recognition, but the fact that the world kept the moment, that they let it live somewhere outside of me. Because for so long, everything I built lived in silence, in back-end systems, in blueprints, in wires hidden in walls, and policies written in documents no one read unless something broke. And for so long, it felt like I had vanished with it. But now, that small clip, that broadcast, that sentence, it exists in the world like a marker. A flag planted in time saying, "This happened, this mattered, he mattered." I don't replay it for pride. I replay it sometimes to remind myself it wasn't a dream. It still makes me sit a little straighter when I hear it in another room, not from ego, but from gratitude. Not because it fixes everything that was left unsaid, but because it proves that not everything has to be said in the moment to be heard in the end. That clip is short, barely 2 minutes, but it outlives the years I spent being invisible in meetings. It drowns out the moments where I was asked to stay quiet, stay small, stay out of the way. It stands longer than the silence that followed my best work, because now every time it plays, it tells the truth. Not a truth of mine. And it tells it not with emotion, not with argument, but with clarity. A name, spoken cleanly, spoken on record, spoken in front of the very world that once called me irrelevant. And even after I'm gone, long after the chairs change, the rooms repaint, the passwords reset, and the documents update, that recording will remain. Someone will hear it. Some intern scrolling archives, some student researching history, some stranger clicking a link without knowing why, and in those seconds my silence will speak. Not as a memory, as a fact. Not he was, but he is. And that will outlast every room that ever forgot me. Every voice that said I no longer belonged. Every meeting that skipped my name. The broadcast is saved in their system now, and so am I.